Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the RSIS-SPRINGER book launch webinar on humanitarianism in the Asia Pacific, engaging the debate in policy and practice. I'm Al Cook, coordinator of the Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Program and senior fellow at the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies here at RSIS, and I will moderate today's event. The global humanitarian system is often characterized as dominated by the United Nations system, Western donor governments, and large Western-based international non-governmental organizations. These voices have shaped much of the global discourse on humanitarian action for decades. In these global conversations, they have primarily focused on conflict settings, which makes sense when around 80% of the global humanitarian activity is conflict-focused, and only 20% is focused on natural hazards. However, humanitarian action in the Asia Pacific is a different story, where the reverse of this is true. 80% of humanitarian work is focused on natural hazards, and around 20% is focused on conflict settings. These are broad generalizations, but serve the point that what we experience here in the Asia Pacific has impacted the way we govern humanitarian action in the region. In the Asia Pacific, the people and organizations involved in this work are more varied, with national governments playing an important role. Rather, we see the importance of three important criteria that determine who and or which organization is involved. These are capacity, proximity, and legitimacy. Capacity is the ability for an organization to deliver a humanitarian mandate. Proximity as the relative ability to access or activate in natural hazard settings, and legitimacy of an organization, which is often determined by the national government and the communities in which they work. It is within this setting that brought us together to collaborate on this book project. So firstly, some housekeeping announcements. I will shortly hand over to Dr. Lina Gong, who's co-editor and research fellow on the HADR program at the NTS Center, to give an overview of the edited book. And then we will hear interventions from four contributors: Julius Trajono, research fellow at the NTS Center; Christopher Chen, Associate Research Fellow on the HADR program at the NTS Center; Tiola, a former research analyst on the Indonesia program; and Kioni Marzuki, Associate Research Fellow on the Indonesia program. Our discussant today is Dr. Caroline Brassard, Adjunct Assistant Professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. We will then open up to question and answers before I will hand over to Alex Westcott Campbell, who is the Senior Publishing Editor at Springer, to offer some closing remarks. But first, I would like to personally thank all the contributors to this book and would like to recognize three of the contributors who are with us today as registered participants: Professor Derek McDougall of the University of Melbourne in Australia, Professor Ella Atienza of the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and Professor Hongsheng Sheng of Shanghai University of Political Science and Law in China, who are all with us today. We are also grateful for the support given to us by our institution, the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, particularly in organizing the two conferences that brought together the contributors of this book. I would also like to personally recognize the support and help of Charlotte Yu, Xin Chiam, and Joey Liang. One last housekeeping announcement before I hand over the floor. For questions, please enter them in the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and I will then moderate the Q&A discussion after the interventions from the contributors. So without further ado, Lina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Al, for your opening remarks. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Al's lead in the project, as well as the contribution of all our contributors to the book, without which we cannot make it happen. So this book is an output of our project called Asia and the Humanitarian World, conducted in 2018 and 2019, Elle and I first came up with this idea in the second half of 2018 after the earthquake and tsunami in central Sulawesi. Elle and another colleague of the HADR program went to Indonesia, Jakarta, and the disaster-affected areas to have field research. There, they got a very good understanding of how things did or did not work and how disaster response and international cooperation improved and evolved in the region. If we compare to 10 to 15 years ago, say the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. After they came back, we had a discussion and agreed that it would be great if we could present the understanding and practice of the Asia Pacific countries about humanitarian work to a broad audience, to inform humanitarian policy making, and to encourage academic debates on the key issues. The global humanitarian work is largely dominated by humanitarian concerns induced by conflicts, as Elle just mentioned. However, climate change actually poses a grave challenge to the humanitarian community as the frequencies and intensity of natural hazards has increased as a result of climate change. Other effects of climate change also test our disaster management system, such as sea level rise and climate-induced diseases. So this possibility has been recognized, actually. The World Humanitarian Summit in 2016 set out the agenda for humanity. Of the 7 core commitments is natural disasters and climate change. As Elle mentioned, the Asia-Pacific region, particularly Southeast Asia, is the most disaster-prone in the world. And the humanitarian practice and understanding of this region is heavily informed by their experience in dealing with natural hazards. The aim of this project was to map out the new trends and emerging issues in the humanitarian sector in this region, to highlight the relevance of the Asia-Pacific perspectives to the global humanitarian community, and to connect scholars and practitioners of humanitarian affairs. For such purposes, we brought together a group of 15 scholars from across the Asia-Pacific region in 2 conferences in February and December 2019, respectively, to share their observations and reflections on how major countries as well as actors in the region with humanitarian responsibilities conceptualize and practice humanitarianism. Essentially, they answer questions such as what has shaped Asia-Pacific countries' perspectives of humanitarianism, what are the positions of prominent countries and sectors in the region on the key issues, whether and how they differ from one another, and what roles different actors play in managing disasters, such as the government, the military, regional organization, NGOs, and the private sector. In this book, we have the perspectives from traditional and emerging donors, developing countries vulnerable to natural hazards, regional organization, and the private sector as well as the military in the Asia Pacific. Japan and Australia represent the traditional donors whose commitments and preferred mode of assistance can be influenced by domestic politics and geopolitical considerations. China and India are emerging actors in the global humanitarian system, while their developmental orientation in foreign assistance coincides with the increasing emphasis on the humanitarian development nexus, they have reservations over their certain aspects of the existing paradigm of foreign assistance. Indonesia and the Philippines are on the receiving end of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts. And ASEAN has emerged as the preeminent platform for cooperation and coordination in Southeast Asia. Their experiences and lessons accumulated throughout the operations over the years can be of great value for an informed strategy in the global humanitarian system. For the speakers who will follow my remarks, such as Tiola, Keone, and Julius and Chris, I will leave it to them to introduce their respective chapters to the audience. So essentially, the book have 4 chapters that are on China. These reflect the fact that China's involvement in humanitarian affairs is expanding significantly. So the first one is written by me. It examines how China defines and uses the concept of humanitarianism and argues that while the state-centric and development-oriented approach has enabled China to materialize its comparative advantage in capacity and resources, China faces challenges to prove its approach as a robust alternative to the existing ones. The second piece was written by Professor Yu Ji. It discusses how the People's Liberation Army conceptualizes and practices humanitarian action at home and abroad. The third article was written by Dr. Peng Lin. It analyzes China's disaster diplomacy in the context of China-Nepal relations as part of its policy toolkit and the limitations it will face as an established humanitarian player. The fourth article was written by Professor Sheng Hongsheng as well as Professor Liu Tiehua. It reviews China's engagement with the humanitarian components of the UN system since the 1970s. And it discusses how China has become a leading actor in the UN system. India is another emerging humanitarian actor or leading humanitarian actor in the Asia Pacific as part of its Act East policy under Prime Minister Modi since 2014. And Paula Banerjee traces the historical factors that have shaped India's understanding of humanitarianism and provides insight into India's responses to major humanitarian emergencies in the world. Traditional donors in the humanitarian system like Japan and Australia have been key sources of funding and resources. Masataka Nakauchi traces the development of Japan's approach to humanitarian aid since 1990s, and he observed the rise and fall of the concept of human security in Japan's foreign policy. He identifies the tendency of the Abe administration to move away from the approach to foreign assistance that center on human security. And he also explores the role of Japan's self-defense force in Japan's humanitarian assistance abroad. Professor Derek McDougall examines Australia's leading role in disaster response in the South Pacific, and he argues that Australia's multi-sectoral approach to humanitarian engagement has been implemented through bilateral and multilateral partnerships. ASEAN provides an increasingly important forum for humanitarian partnerships, evident in its relations or cooperation with Australia, China, India, and Japan in this area. Alistair Cook discusses how ASEAN's regional architecture for humanitarian affairs has evolved, and he argues that Southeast Asian governments maintain a primary role in humanitarian affairs, and the regional organization provides the forum for discussion and coordination and dialogues in humanitarian affairs. And non-state actors are key stakeholders in post-disaster response and relief and recovery effort. Randy Chatterjee divides the engagement of the private sector into short-term and long-term activities, and he argues that we should pay attention to both types of efforts to give a broader space for private sector to play their role. Well, Ella Atienza and Denise Quilala focus on the enabling environment in the Philippines for NGOs to play a role in disaster response and describe the contributions of NGOs in time of disasters. And because the project was conducted before COVID-19, we didn't cover the topic in the book itself, but I believe the volume lays a good foundation for how humanitarian work will evolve in complex emergencies, as we have seen during COVID-19, that some countries had to deal with both COVID-19 and other humanitarian emergencies, either induced by natural hazards or by conflicts. And now I would like to invite my colleague, Christopher Chen, to introduce his book or his chapter. Chris, please.
Yeah, thank you, Lina. Let me just. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Lina. So as more disasters occur and the needs of affected populations increase, right? The global humanitarian community at large faces the challenge of whether and how to integrate new actors into the system to leverage the strengths of different stakeholders. So my chapter identifies one such actor, i.e. the military in the Asia-Pacific region, and discusses some of the opportunities and challenges that it brings. My chapter looks at some of the attempts to integrate the military into the regional humanitarian system. It assesses how the evolving nature of the humanitarian landscape raises new dilemmas. So, for example, while traditional humanitarians are committed to upholding the principles of humanitarianism, other stakeholders might not be motivated by such humanitarian logic. So by exploring the role of the military as a humanitarian actor, as well as the contentions surrounding its entry into the humanitarian arena, my chapter aims to inform efforts to navigate the gap between non-traditional and traditional humanitarian actors. I think in the region, there is a collective acknowledgement and agreement among states and humanitarian actors that militaries can actually help to fill the capacity gap in humanitarian responses. We can see this is evident from the various attempts made in the region to institutionalize military to military and civil military engagement in HADR. So forums such as the RCG, or the short for the Regional Consultative Group on Humanitarian Civil Military Coordination, can help to facilitate knowledge sharing among humanitarian, civilian, and military actors involved in aid provision and HADR activities. So these platforms actually enable them to understand one another's niche capabilities, specific needs, as well as motivations for providing aid, which will foster better interoperability and coordination. So I think military involvement in the region is actually is considered an important aspect of disaster response and humanitarian relief, because militaries can actually provide surge capacity to civilian institutions at the national level during disaster responses. With the active role of national governments in disaster response, except in extreme circumstances where a disaster actually overwhelms the national government's capacity, the use of foreign militaries is also a trend that we see happening in the region. And these foreign militaries are offered qualified legitimacy of sorts by the national governments to support disaster response efforts. So I think what we can observe in the region is that there is a delicate balancing act. So on one hand, we see general acceptance of the fact that the military is and will always be a first responder in relief efforts. However, in this region, especially in Southeast Asia, where states still zealously guard their sovereignty, we are also observing attempts to ensure that militaries, especially foreign militaries, do not overstep their boundaries and are granted legitimacy by national governments and regional organizations. And I think what is important to take note of is that military involvement, it takes on a greater degree of ambiguity when humanitarian emergencies are of a complex nature. For example, when a disaster happens hits a community that is already afflicted with pre-existing tensions, such as political violence or internal conflict. So that's where the the military as a humanitarian actor becomes a very sensitive and contentious issue. So that's just a brief overview of my chapter. Recent developments in the space. So discussions at recent RCG meetings actually indicate the possibility of exploring greater linkages between current civil military mechanisms in HADR, as well and police and law enforcement agencies. So this development is actually particularly significant in countries with no standing militaries. So for example, in the Pacific, police forces and police agencies are often operate as their country's domestic law enforcement agencies, as well as providing national security capabilities. So across the Pacific, I think only 3 countries have standing militaries, PNG, Fiji, and Tonga, while the rest have all rely on police forces. So police components in these countries are actually intrinsically linked and engaged in disaster responses. And they are often the only emergency agency in the country with the capacity and the know-how to respond to a disaster. And so this gives them the status as de facto first responder. So in any given relief effort, I think the police will play a very important role in terms of communication, in terms of coordination and providing logistics and maintaining public order, and as well as being a link between the affected community and the national disaster management officers. So this is one of trends that we might be heading towards in the future, as the rise of the police or law enforcement agencies as another important humanitarian actor in the Asia Pacific region. Yeah, so that's just a brief, I've just given a brief outline of my chapter as well as some of the recent developments. I'll be interested to reply to any queries or questions during the quick Q&A. Thank you.
I think we will now hand over to the next speakers for their intervention. So can I ask for Tiola or Keone to take the floor, please?
Sure, thanks, Al. So my colleague Keone and I co-authored the chapter on Indonesia's humanitarian engagement. And basically our main point is to demonstrate how and to what extent the Indonesian government ties its humanitarian actions to its national interest and foreign policy goals. And we basically argue that Indonesia employs humanitarianism as diplomacy, which is humanitarian actions that are deployed to promote its national interest instead of solely or purely for humanitarian purpose. So we borrowed the definition from Jacinta O'Hagan, who says that humanitarianism as diplomacy is basically humanitarianism to promote a state's interest. And this is different, although not necessarily at odds with humanitarian diplomacy, which the ICRC defines as a strategy for influencing the parties to armed conflicts, where the purpose is purely humanitarian. So ultimately, the difference between the two lies in the primary imperatives. Whether the humanitarian actions are primarily pursued in the interest of the recipient or of the self. In this case, is the state. But then in practice, the two concepts are not always mutually exclusive, and they are indeed often complementary to one another. And we acknowledge that this is not a particularly unique case to Indonesia. Many other states also conduct humanitarian affairs based on states' interest. But we think what is interesting about Indonesia's case is to see how sometimes there are tensions between the state interest and some humanitarian principles, particularly the principle of impartiality that is as defined by the ICRC. And it's not always intention, it's only in some cases. And by definition of ICRC, impartiality means that humanitarian action must be carried out in the basis of need alone, regardless of nationality, race, gender, religious belief, political opinions. And we understand that this definition is debatable, but we think that it's still a useful concept to measure when we talk about how Indonesia conducts its humanitarian actions. which is often done based on principles like, Muslim solidarity, ASEAN solidarity. So, for example, domestically, there is a debate about the distribution of collected alms from Muslims. The more dominant interpretation is that the fund should only be distributed to fellow Muslims. So that is based on religions. But then there has been some newer more moderate interpretations that the funds can be distributed to non-Muslims as well, especially in urgent cases, in disaster relief, as long as this community do not harm the Muslim community. But that's the domestic part of it. But what we focus more in the chapter is the humanitarianism as diplomacy overseas, which is reflected in Indonesia's focus and priorities in humanitarian affairs. And we highlight that it largely revolves around the crisis in ASEAN and causes related to Muslim communities worldwide, and also the Pacific Island countries in relations to Papua. Keone will elaborate more on each of the cases, but just an overview that basically in ASEAN, Indonesia's motivations in deploying humanitarian actions are closely linked to its aspiration to show leadership within the organization. And we know that, there is also an element of solidarity as fellow ASEAN members, but mostly the motivation is also political, to be the regional leaders of ASEAN. And the same goes for the Muslim communities, in which the government really embraced the strategic value of assisting fellow Muslims in the Muslim world, especially in winning the hearts and minds of the Muslim majority population in Indonesia. Because as you know, there has been a growing sense of Islamism in Indonesia in the past few years. So this kind of move is really appealing for domestic audience at home, and also to raise Indonesia's profile as a prominent player abroad in the Muslim world, excuse me, in organizations like the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And the last one, we will also demonstrate it through Indo-Aid, which is a new fund that the Indonesian government just established in 2019. We see that this aid is mostly channeled to Pacific Island countries, which have been vocal against Indonesia's treatments to Papua, to the Papuan people, and which has been met by criticism by some human rights activists who argue that basically the fund is Indonesia's way to appease Pacific Island countries to minimize their supports for pro-Papuan independence groups in Indonesia. I'll hand over to Keone to elaborate each of these points.
Thank you, Tiola. I think that pretty much covers basically our entire chapter. I think I'm just going to round up a little bit what Tiola has elaborated. I think it's important to note that Indonesia's humanitarian engagements are primarily rooted at the preamble to its constitution, the 1945 Constitution, and the state ideology of Pancasila. And at its essence, Indonesia's humanitarianism can be understood as the promotion of human welfare based on humanity and justice, with an emphasis on the liberation from oppression. But in practice, this philosophy is expressed through direct government involvement in providing humanitarian relief, as well as contribution to the UN peacekeeping operations. But these two that are covered in our chapter is not exhaustive, as my colleague Tiola have mentioned. Indonesia's humanitarian engagements, as defined on its own terms, also includes hosting of refugees, as well as disaster mitigation diplomacy in Pacific Island countries. As my colleague Tiola have touched upon, Indonesia's humanitarian engagements serves almost a dual purpose. Either it's for humanitarian purposes, but also for whether it's placating domestic audiences, whether it's to boost international prestige and promote Indonesia's leadership regionally and globally, or as a means of diplomacy to court influence and curry favor from other countries. Again, Indonesia's humanitarian engagements are heavily characterized by its engagement to provide relief for Muslim countries and Muslim communities and countries around the globe, such as the Palestinians, Bangladesh, and Rohingyas, and so to a lesser extent also the people of Afghanistan. And this is driven by a sense of Muslim solidarity that most Indonesians, held quite religiously, because this is as a part of expression that Indonesia as a Muslim majority country, and also often this expression of solidarity is not monopolized just by the Indonesian state, but also by the various non-governmental Islamic organizations in Indonesia that has been arguably very active in delivering humanitarian assistance. I would say that these organizations often have a better penetration in terms of delivering aid and relief to the affected populace because of their own networks and because they are not hindered by certain bureaucracies that the Indonesian state faces. In addition to their self-organized fundraising, these Islamic organizations often also collaborate with the government, and they've quite recently have mingled with one another to become partners, as evidence in the case of Rohingyas, the relief for Rohingyas people that are affected by the conflict in Myanmar. The second aspect of Indonesia's humanitarian engagement discussed in our chapter is its surging contribution in peacekeeping operations. This is particularly prevalent under the presidency of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, whose foreign policy focused on boosting Indonesia's participation in international institutions. But what is unique in the case of Indonesia is that Indonesia not only sends soldiers these days, but also medical workers and combat engineers that play a role in delivering humanitarian assistance and the setting up of emergency facilities to help ease the plight of civilians in the conflict area. And lastly, as my colleague Tiola mentioned, Indonesia is now also venturing towards disaster management diplomacy as part of its humanitarian engagements. Leveraging on the frequent disasters that the country faced and the subsequent development of expertise in disaster management, Indonesia had assisted several Pacific countries such as Fiji and Tonga to help develop disaster preparedness. Indonesia also aims to play a larger role in the specific areas of disaster relief, especially in the areas of in the Pacific. Through the establishment of Indonesian Agency for International Development, or INDO-AID. It is an aid and developmental assistance body set up by the Joko Widodo administration in the late 2019 under the auspices of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So these actually targeted several Pacific countries, essentially to help soften the criticisms of Indonesians various human rights violations, indications of human rights violations in Papua. Thank you.
Thanks, Tiola and Keone, for your intervention. May I now ask Julius to take the floor, but before he does, if anyone has questions, you can also send them to, I think, everybody in the chat box, as well as directly to me. So please remember to share those, and we will then have a Q&A session after the interventions have concluded. Julius, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Al and Lina, for co-leading this book project. So my chapter is titled The Humanitarian Phase of U.S. Philippine Security Alliance, Humanitarian Partners, Friends, and Allies. So this is basically a case study of the role of bilateral security alliance in humanitarian affairs. While this chapter was written before the pandemic, let me also include some recent trends and developments concerning the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has impacted, or what is the role of the bilateral security alliance between Washington and Manila. The long-standing treaty alliance between the United States and the Philippines has undergone evolving strategic goals since the end of World War II, from the specter of Cold War conflicts, terrorism, China's assertiveness, to providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or HADR. With the rising intensity and frequency of disasters that regularly hit the Philippines, the humanitarian phase of the US-Philippine Security Alliance addresses critical challenges to the Philippines' HADR operations. From the Philippine perspective, the security partnership helps the Philippines prepare for and respond effectively to disasters and humanitarian emergencies, as the United States provides the much-needed capacity-building assistance, logistics, and financial aid to humanitarian relief and rehabilitation. The Philippines' humanitarian norms and frameworks have evolved through the years from focusing on disaster relief or response to more proactive disaster preparedness, risk mitigation, and empowered participation of local and grassroots actors. And in this regard, I argue that the Philippines' evolving humanitarian norms have broadly and significantly influenced the US humanitarian assistance to the Philippines through the years, putting further emphasis on disaster preparedness, community resilience, and local capacity. And the alliance in this context is not just limited to providing relief aid and sending military assets in times of disasters, as we have seen during the Typhoon Haiyan. It has become more comprehensive and deeper, reaching the grassroots level that entails capacity building as well as financial and technical assistance to the country's vulnerable communities. And one evident research gap in the current studies on US-Philippine Security Alliance is the lack of discussion on US humanitarian assistance in the fields of disaster preparedness, community resilience, and risk mitigation, and US partnership with Philippine local and grassroots actors. And US humanitarian assistance to the Philippines is no longer limited to joint balikatan or military exercises on disaster response and US military deployment in the aftermath of a disaster. So why is foreign humanitarian assistance needed in the Philippines? The Philippines is among the top 5 most disaster-prone countries in the world. There are typhoons, volcanic eruptions, now the humanitarian impact of the pandemic, and the internal armed conflicts in the southern Philippines and in peripheral regions due to decades-long communist insurgency. And despite credible efforts towards disaster preparedness, the Philippines' vulnerable nature makes the international community a crucial part of humanitarian affairs in the country. The Philippines has always been welcoming towards accepting assistance from international actors and has included them even in internal security or domestic issues, such as the Mindanao conflict resolution. The United States in particular helped the Philippines in disaster relief operations in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan in 2013 and providing humanitarian aid during and after the Marawi conflict in 2017. And in the current context of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the humanitarian assistance of the United States to the Philippines for COVID-19 response has been responsive, timely, and impactful. After Super Typhoon Haiyan, the Philippine government realized that the need to shift its framework from merely reactive disaster response to more proactive disaster mitigation and preparedness. And there are at least 2 humanitarian norms that have emerged in the Philippines in recent years, in which the US humanitarian assistance is also filling the gaps through its capacity building assistance. They are number one, disaster preparedness through pre-disaster risk assessment and mitigation, and number two, localization and community building resilience with multi-stakeholder participation. A major gap in the Philippines preparedness and risk assessment framework is the weak capability of communities and local governments or subnational governments to conduct such risk assessment and reduce their own vulnerabilities. And this is one area where U.S. humanitarian assistance to the Philippines tries to plug the gaps through helping the local humanitarian actors in addressing the vulnerabilities of disaster-prone communities. In particular, the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, strongly supported the Center for Disaster Preparedness Foundation. It's a Philippine organization in its work towards helping vulnerable communities in the Zamboanga Peninsula, located in the southern Philippines or Mindanao, to protect themselves from these communities from the adverse impact of floods and droughts. And the Center for Disaster Preparedness Foundation helps local actors from town authorities down to families with safety protocols, and also assists in capacity building in key urban centers. Now, how does the U.S. humanitarian assistance help strengthen localization and community resilience norm? One example is since 2014, the USAID has been partnering with humanitarian organization, the Catholic Relief Services, CRS, in helping local governments, disaster management councils to promote community-based disaster risk reduction programs. Now, in the context of U.S. COVID-19 assistance to the Philippines, USAID likewise helped boost local capacity and community resilience. It must be noted that the Philippines has been among the worst hit countries in ASEAN by the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the number of cases and economic impact. And USAID's robust engagements with local and grassroots actors facilitated targeted and impactful COVID-19 assistance to vulnerable communities. And to date, total US government COVID-19 assistance to the Philippines amounts to nearly 1.3 billion pesos or 27 million US dollars. And it has been deployed to address the multifaceted impact of the pandemic on local communities. And this kind of US assistance goes beyond donating medical supplies and hospital equipment. For example, local governments in hardest hit areas have received technical assistance from USAID to strengthen their crisis management, communication, and response strategies. For example, USAID provided capacity support to 10 local governments in Muslim Mindanao affected by the Marawi siege to reduce the impact of the pandemic on displaced people. USAID has also targeted capacity building projects for village-level public health facilities to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 in impoverished communities. USAID partners with the private sector and civil society to help sustain livelihoods amid the economic downturn. For example, it has provided key digital solutions to enhance supply chains of medical products, foods, and other necessary goods, as well as cash relief to vulnerable communities. So this COVID-19 assistance is the most recent evidence of how US-Philippines alliance work without the need to utilize the military component. It clearly shows that whether it is in the context of disaster or a global pandemic, the long-standing US partnerships with Filipino grassroots and local actors through USAID and its partner organizations have significantly deepened and broadened the bilateral security alliance even beyond military-led engagements. US humanitarian assistance aimed at boosting local capacities could also be viewed as more cost-effective with higher impact than the actual deployment of American military personnel and assets in the aftermath of a disaster, as these projects help prepare communities minimize the impact of natural catastrophes that could hit them. And in conclusion, assistance projects funded and supported by USAID do not require the large-scale deployment of US military troops and assets. And such USAID projects require only working with its Philippine humanitarian partners and community-based humanitarian organizations. And this type of humanitarian assistance would also help the United States avoid the politically sensitive issue of stationing American troops in the country, while deepening the people-to-people relations with Filipinos through its high-impact community-based humanitarian projects. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Julius. Just to remind people to add in questions into the chat function before we come to the question and answer session. But before we do that, I would gladly thank and invite Dr. Caroline Brassard in her role as discussant, to comment on the book and perhaps draw out some of her takeaways and observations. Caroline, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Al. I will actually be sharing my screen. I have prepared a few slides for this purpose. Okay, so I would like to, first of all, congratulate Alistair Cook and Lina Gong for editing this volume at a period that, of course, brings much more constraints given the COVID-19. So it is a welcome addition to academic debate. I am a faculty at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at NUS and also an academic advisor at BRAC University in Bangladesh at the Center for Peace and Justice, where we work closely on the Rohingya refugee crisis as well. So I say this because some of my examples might be taken from that. So I think that I will start my, my contribution with the conclusions of the volume. And so there are three main conclusions. One is that national governments in Asia Pacific take a dominant role compared to other regions in the world, as Alistair mentioned during the introductory remarks. The second main conclusion across all chapters is that the humanitarian systems are really rooted on local context and localized experiences. So not so much international best practices all the time, but very much capturing the context. The third main conclusion of the book is that there is an increased diversity of humanitarian actors. Of course, as we know, Asia Pacific itself is extremely diverse, including some of the biggest in terms of population and geographical spread countries, as well as some of the smallest in the Pacific Islands, for example. So it is very difficult to draw a commonality. However, I think that the book succeeded very much in highlighting these three conclusions. So what I'm interested in, coming from the public policy field, is to think about this question below. What are the implications for humanitarianism in Asia Pacific towards proactive policy making? So that would tie in all of these three conclusions. As Julius was just relating a moment ago, there is a tendency now to focus and prioritize beyond reactive towards proactive activities, proactive decision-making, proactive policy making and planning. So this, I think, is the future. And this is what this region presents as an opportunity. As many of the speakers have highlighted already, this region is most affected by natural hazards. And there are ways for us to also capitalize on the knowledge-making national level organizations towards understanding in advance some of these risks and hazards. For example, the national meteorological organizations. So I'd like to start by coming back a little bit, one step, looking at the policymaking process. So the subtitle of the book to me was very engaging, engaging in policy and practice. So I tried to look at it from that angle today. So the policymaking process would include 5 main functions. First of all, is identifying problems to put on the agenda. That means prioritizing. Eventually looking at the potential options that could solve this problem. And then implementing the policies and evaluating the impact. However, some of these functions in policymaking tend to be neglected. And I think that this is still a challenge within the humanitarian system. I'd like to highlight that. But the policy process, even within the humanitarian system, is not a cycle from one step to the other. It rather looks messy like this. We go from understanding problems to looking at different options, testing things out, and then coming back and working with different stakeholders. And it's a very dynamic and fast-moving environment. It is actually a very complex environment to work on. So this is the starting point. Now, there are obviously common problems with implementation when it comes to relief and rehabilitation and the whole cycle for disaster management. And some of the common problems that we can identify are as follows. Well, there might be some political conflict or disagreements within and between ministries and within national level organizations, as well as between national level organizations and non-government organizations. Other types of problems can be analytical, so bad planning, bad targeting, bad logistical procedures. Operational, that's one that is very easy to understand. Lack of funding, and that has been declining over time, as we know. Lack of human resources, a lack of time as well, and lack of expertise. So I'd like to address that later on. Another problem of implementation is social. A lack of understanding of beliefs, attitudes, values that can shape the way, I don't like to call recipients, but that's how the terminology still is very much recipients from humanitarian assistance can actually affect the potential impact of humanitarian activities. And then there is another type of implementation problem, which everybody now would be extremely aware of, which is bad luck, such as the pandemic. So that adds a layer of complexity to any activity. It can be something else, such as a financial crash. So now I'd like to then proceed with the main component of my little comments this afternoon, which is what do these experiences in Asia Pacific teach us in terms of what we need to think about in the future towards really having a proactive agenda and reduce impacts of conflicts and as well as natural disasters. I would like to suggest 6 specific points that I think some of them are directly linked with some of the chapters in the book, and that I will tie this up with the conclusions of the book at the end. So the first 2 aspects are the importance of building on existing networks and creating networks that are missing. So these would be, for example, organizations that have been designed or that come from grassroots organizations like volunteer organizations. It can be, retiree firefighters that now can organize themselves to work on relief efforts. It can be like large-scale volunteer organizations that were meant or kind of facilitated, and capacity was built for them to support another event, and then the event is finished. I'm thinking about the Chinese Olympics in 2008. After that, there was a massive amount of volunteers, and they were all very well organized. And then they needed to, they wanted to continue doing some volunteer work. And so that has led to a tendency, as I recall, towards trying to leverage on these grassroots organizations and especially volunteer organizations. And in Japan, I believe that there is also efforts to professionalize these volunteer organizations by building their capacity. And here I put on my slide also other types of networks that I think we need to think about a little bit more, which are about financing for disaster management. So combining different financial mechanisms and risk transfer instruments from different parts of governments in order to, again, create this, fill this gap in the network. That is a really key number one to proactive policymaking. The second is really improving the information flow. Timely, targeted information through varied channels, educating, raising awareness and knowledge about disaster risks and the politics around it. That's kind of, in a nutshell, the second point. Now, I'd like to come back to an earlier example I gave, which was, inherently, governments have invested quite a lot, given this mega trend of climate change and the impact on combined with urbanization, such that the disasters are more costly than before because of the built infrastructure. Maybe less people die of natural disasters, but they are more costly for governments. So there has been really efforts into trying to increase and improve information flow, not just the quantity of information, but also the channels through which it is spread, and the changing the way that we provide information. I do recall from Hayam that there were terminologies that were not well explained to the population. For example, storm surge, that actually could have saved a lot of lives if people understood how what these terms meant. So my point is that often what we see is that there is a barrier in this information flow due to expert talk, meaning that people are using maybe statistics and terminology that are a little bit too specific and specialized, and that may not be well understood by those who would actually gain a lot from this kind of information flow. So I think that is something that we really have to, again, think carefully about. Now, this actually leads me to my first main conclusion, which is understanding the power of soft policy instruments. So I'll take one half step back and talk about what are policy instruments. So governments can use laws and regulations, economic, financial instruments, decide on priority for public investments, and provide mechanisms for incentives, punishment, or rewards in policymaking, and of course, planning, such as urban planning. But there's another category of policy instruments that I think reverberates across many of the chapters in the book, which is soft instruments. What are these? Well, there are two categories. One is cooperation-based. So we're talking about the multiplicity of actors, the diversity, and also different levels of capacity. So cooperation-based, that is about working together with organizations, be it non-governmental or even grassroots, to build and strengthen these voluntary commitments, negotiate and create networks, as I have just said. The second aspect of policy instruments that are called soft instruments, which I think that these experiences in Asia Pacific is really kind of pointing towards, is information-based. So really strengthening our capacity to provide effective information campaigns, providing advisory services by those organizations that build knowledge on preventive policymaking and proactive policymaking towards these disasters or conflicts. Building capacity, that's another part of soft instruments. monitoring and evaluation, which I'll come back in a moment, and finally, public education. So that to me captures the first 2 points that I'm trying to convey today about policy, proactive policy making. The second set of points are about coming back to implementation challenges that I said. One of the implementation challenges of new actors especially are the lack of knowledge to perceptions and behaviors on the ground. I do recall Alistair talking about in the introduction some of the, I suppose, determinants of who acts when and why and how. And he raised 3 points. He raised the capacity of an organization or a unit, proximity and legitimacy. And I think that proximity is relatively fixed. Proximity to a disaster, proximity to the affected community is relatively fixed. But capacity and legitimacy are interlinked, and there is a potential virtuous cycle within these two that we can reinforce through specific capacity building or activities. And this is what I would like to suggest here, is to look into the patterns, the perceptions and behaviors on the ground through implementation evaluation. I will contrast the two in a moment. Implementation evaluation versus impact evaluation. So one is understanding perceptions and behaviors, and that I fully agree with Tiola and Kioni about, the experience of in Indonesia about the religious organizations that are very much connected to the ground and that can really fully understand some of these unseen or more cultural aspects of reactions to humanitarian activities. So that is one of the 2 points. The second point is ensuring accountability of humanitarian aid. And that can only be done if there is an effort, and that has been something that over decades has been a problem, on impact evaluation. What is ultimately the impact of all this effort, all this money that is being spent? And so that will really help to contextualize, to strengthen the downward accountability. But it requires skills, time, and people. So it leads me to my second main conclusion or implication to the conclusion of the book, which is the importance of evaluation. I'd like now to contrast the different types of evaluation in context. So if you think about evaluation, that typically is the weakest link in the humanitarian sector, in the development sector, and even in public policy in general. Not enough attention is paid to especially impact evaluation. Most of the evaluations that are being made in order for us to understand the efficiency and effectiveness are actually done on the monitoring, the monitoring of operations, and that relates to efficiency. So what I typically see is that we have, what is being spent and specific outputs, number of beneficiaries, and so forth. But as we all know, the increased number of beneficiaries is not a symbol of success. In fact, we want to have less people have to depend on specific support. So monitoring efficiency, that's evaluating implementation. So do we have enough budget? Are we targeting the right communities, the right groups? Are we able to also pay attention to not just the communities that are affected, but the host community? And the work that we do in Bangladesh, for example, the million plus Rohingya that came in Cox's Bazar are, of course, putting more pressure on the already low income groups in the host community. So the process of integration, the process not integration, but the process of being equitable in terms of support is part of this efficiency. But what is missing is really effectiveness. So what is the ultimate longer term outcome of all these efforts? Are we reducing risks? Are we improving our capacity to become proactive in policymaking. That could be extremely important to highlight. So the last 2 points now that I'd like to raise are about the role of incentives and rewarding initiatives. In humanitarian assistance, as was noted before, you have the first respondents. Well, Chris mentioned that they were the military. I would argue that they are actually the survivors, but that's besides the point. So rewarding incentives that actually can really complement government roles, such as these public-private partnerships, as highlighted earlier by Lina in one of the chapters, that would eventually reduce the cost of humanitarian efforts, should really be part of what we are trying to build as our kind of basket of skills for proactive policymaking. And finally, the community resilience would imply that we need to have these stakeholder engagement. Now, again, Julius talked about that in many chapters in the book, talk about partnerships and stakeholder engagement. But it is important to think about it in a priority areas, by priority areas. Not everybody can be involved in everything. So I think there is a scope for a whole of society approach, but it's very difficult to achieve. So as a starting point, perhaps we can look at different models of stakeholder engagement. So my third implication for the book is understanding how stakeholder engagement can support the localization of humanitarian effort. And as we know, the goal was that from the Humanitarian Summit that by 2020, 25% of funding, international funding, should go to local and national organizations that are participating in humanitarian effort. And in order for that to happen, you have to build capacity. So my last, almost my last slide is about really thinking about this so-called partnership with stakeholders in a little bit more discerning way. In fact, true partnership can only happen with so many different actors. So I'd like to just show here a kind of conceptualization of stakeholder engagement. So on the left here, you have the level of influence and interest in the specific context that we're looking at. I'm going to remain generic here. And then you have the level of stakeholder engagement in terms of not just information sharing, but decision making and implementation. That's partnership. So at the bottom, you have the pool communication where you're basically you're assuming that those who need information will come and get it from a centralized location or platform. Push communication is when we are sending out information that is necessary for the communities or whoever actor to have for them to work on. Consultation is when we start to have an engagement with the stakeholders. And here I use stakeholder in a very generic way, including grassroots, non-government and government organization. Then you have an added layer of engagement, which is participation. And now we're starting to have decision-making processes and planning. And finally, partnership, which is really a joint implementation. So I would like us to think about this, the experience of Asia Pacific in this kind of refined way, and learn from this experience by understanding what are some of the partnerships that have been the most effective. So that is really concluding my presentation. I started with the conclusions of the book on the dominant role of national governments, and I have been trying to focus on basically the role of soft policy instruments in proactive policymaking within the humanitarian activities. The second conclusion was that the humanitarian sector is rooted in localized experiences, and there my conclusion that we really need to build skills for evaluation that are also involving the communities themselves. So distinguishing here, of course, between efficiency of processes and implementation and effectiveness, which is more impact oriented. And finally, increased diversity of humanitarian actors means that we have to refine our understanding of the very types of or forms of these multi-stakeholders engagement. So once again, I would like to congratulate Al Cook and Lina Gong for editing this fantastic collection. It is very thought-provoking, and I hope I was able to convey some of the major thinking point that thoughts that came to my mind as I was reading this fabulous volume. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Caroline, for your really important reflections there. And it makes me think immediately about the often used adage of locally led, regionally supported, and international as necessary. But actually putting that into practice is, you've given us a number of key ways there with your focus on the policy-making process. And I particularly like the ideas that you mentioned in terms of improving existing and creating networks, because often people seem to assume that we're operating in vacuums, that there aren't any pre-existing networks for some of these humanitarian activities. Okay, I would like to now move to the question and answer session. So for the panelists, I've had a couple of questions, and there are some here in the general chat as well. So firstly, what I will do is I will group 4 or 5 questions, and then for those who it's relevant for, if you could respond to those if it's directly, and of course if you wish to respond to one generally, then please do so. Okay, this is from Derek McDougall. To what extent is Indonesia's HADR in the South Pacific related to its attempts to neutralize Melanesian concerns about West Papua? So I guess that's to Tiola and Keone. From Jonathan, how does the book cover any success stories in the Asia Pacific where NGOs partner their respective countries' military to implement HADR projects, not by state or military actors, but from the ground up? So if any of the contributors there, perhaps Julius or Chris, have some thoughts on this question from Jonathan. And then from Dr. Salil, he has made a couple of comments there in the chat box. In terms of questions I've been sent here for Lina, how does China differ from these other emerging players? You grouped it at the beginning with emerging players. Is there something that's different about China to the other emerging players? And then for Julius, since Haiyan, more focus has been on localization in the Philippines. And what is the current trend here? Is it now more effective, to use some of those ideas that Caroline had mentioned, in implementing that agenda? So we've seen a lot of headline issues about the local government-led disaster management system and so on. So how far did they get in implementing it? And is there a trend there in that showing some results of being impactful? Okay, so with those 5 questions, maybe I will first turn to Tiola and or Keone, if both of you want to answer that question about this West Papua issue first. And then I will go on to the other panelists.
Thank you, Al. Okay, so the question from Prof. McDougall is, to what extent is Indonesia's HADR in the South Pacific related to its attempts to neutralize Melanesian concerns about West Papua? So the Indonesian government has actually denied that all the grants that they have channeled to the Pacific Island countries are related to softening the criticism from Melanesian countries regarding West Papua. But interestingly, Indonesia has been channeling grants to Pacific Islands countries, notably since 2015, following the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, a pro-Papuan independence group, application for membership with the Melanesian Spearhead Group of the MSG, which is a regional intergovernmental organization in which Indonesia is an associate member. Now, in 2019, 5 out of 7 recipients of the Indo-Aid funds were actually Pacific countries. They are Fiji, Kiribati, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Nauru. Also in 2017, Indonesia signed with Fiji a plan of action on disaster management and cooperation to bolster exchange cooperation in the areas of disaster preparedness, management, and response. So in this sense, there are actually a lot of indications where Indonesia is trying to court several countries from the Pacific Islands countries to more or less to neutralize their concerns. I mean, of course, Indonesian government always denies this sort of thing, but there are more than plenty of indications that it is actually doing so. And some other indications include that Indonesia provided a grant of around $2 million $2 million grant for East Timor, Solomon Islands, and Fiji. This is to help the reconstruction of several areas that were affected by Windstorm Cyclone in 2016. So yeah, there's plenty of indications that these aids to Pacific Islands countries are well interlinked with Indonesia's interests with regards to West Papua. Maybe Tiola, if you want to add on this.
No, I think Keone already covered everything, but just to add a bit that, I mean, although the Indonesian government has denied the allegations that basically the Indo-Aid is to appease the Pacific countries, the Pacific Island countries, as Keone mentioned, it's some clear indications that it has at least a bit to do with it. But in any case, during the launch of the Indo-Aid initiative, Indonesian foreign minister said that the fund is a very precious tool for Indonesian diplomacy. And it's something that Indonesia can tap on to strengthen its presence in international stage. So in any case, there is a strong element of state's interest in it.
Thank you. Chris, do you have a comment on the question about military NGO interaction?
Yeah,
just a short one though.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think the book covers any specific examples or success stories of NGO interactions with the military, but I think in general, it's a bit difficult for NGOs or humanitarian organizations to actually partner with militaries specifically to implement HADR projects. I mean, because of the obvious disconnect between the different principles, right? I mean, military is by nature for national defense or for war, right? As in, it's a fighting organization. But I mean, and NGOs have their own set of humanitarian principles. So in that sense, they don't. I think it would be tough for these two entities to actually cooperate and implement a specific project per se. But I think over the past few years and past 10 years, in fact, I think there have been lots of engagements between the two entities. So like what I mentioned just now about the RCG, so that's a platform to facilitate civil military cooperation. So I mean, like the Singapore Red Cross, for example, they regularly and other NGOs in Singapore, for that matter, they actually regularly participate in tabletop exercises conducted by the Singapore Armed Forces. So I guess in that sense, there is engagement, but I think it would be a stretch to, or we'd be hard pressed to find a specific initiative or project that involves both the military and NGO. And that would be my short reply to John's.
Okay, thanks. Julius, can you tackle the one on Haiyan and localization, that question?
Yes, Al. Yes, indeed, the localization has been now in the mainstream of the Philippine humanitarian landscape. Even now, in terms of COVID-19 response, for example, because of the I should say the failure of the national government to step up. So it's really the maverick local executives in cities or towns in the Philippines, although not all of them, but there are outstanding local actors who are stepping up to ease the burden of their constituents in terms of the impact of COVID-19. So yes, whether it's in the area of disaster response or the humanitarian impact of the pandemic, localization has been in the forefront of mainstream humanitarian landscape. Just one point, Al, in the question on civil society, there's I think Dr. Ella Atienza is here. There's a chapter on the chapter after mine on the role of civil society in disaster response, the Philippine experience. So it's also a good chapter on the success story of the involvement of local NGOs in humanitarian affairs. And in the question on military and civil society in the Philippines, there are many examples of close engagements between local NGOs and military in terms of securing the humanitarian responders in conflict afflicted areas. Sometimes NGOs don't have a choice but to ask for assistance from the local military or police for security. They are also have some collaborative projects in terms of humanitarian relief. So the Philippines, although NGOs there are not homogeneous, there are NGOs who chose not to be involved or work with the military, but there are NGOs, and many of them have no issue working with the military.
Great, thank you. And Lena, if you can answer that big question, but in about a minute,
Sure.
on how does China differ from other emerging players?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to explain, point out that although we mentioned a lot about emerging donors, emerging powers in humanitarian affairs, actually their overall contribution to the whole system remains quite modest. Use China as an example in 2017, when it made its largest contribution to date, it still accounted for about just 1% of the overall global spending. And with regard to the difference between China and other emerging donors, in my own view, I would say first, China's geographical focus is quite interesting. Africa receives a lot of Chinese humanitarian assistance, and Asia comes the second. While this differs to some extent from other emerging donors that focus primarily on their neighborhood. And second, I would say geopolitical considerations will be a factors that China need to consider carefully when making the decision, like what to deploy and where how the size of its contribution, etc. And the third one is China is considered politically important by many international agencies as well as humanitarian organizations. Although they recognize that at the current stage, China's contribution remains not significant, but they see China's weight in negotiation, in political settings or conflict situations. So that's the 3 points I have to make. Yeah, thanks.
Great, well, thank you, and thanks to the panelists here for your contributions today. May I now give the floor to Alex, who is the senior editor at Springer. Alex, the floor is yours.
Great. So thanks everyone for the presentation, and congratulations to the contributing authors and to Lina and to Al on a fantastic edited volume that's been published in the last 8 weeks. As mentioned, I'm the senior publishing editor for the Humanities and Social Sciences covering Southeast and East Asia. And when Al and Lina wrote to me about this project, I was instantly excited about the proposal and what was put forward. So I would just like to firstly take this opportunity to congratulate you and to thank you for the entire process from proposal stage, the manuscript development stage, patience during the review process. And this is a graphic that pretty much summarizes very colorfully the entire process of producing a book. And as you know, it's a lot of hard work, and congratulations on its publication. The Springer Brief, Humanitarianism in the Asia Pacific, engaging the debate in policy and practice, has been published in our Springer Briefs in Political Science series. This is a very active series. It produces short books up to 125 pages. And the Springer Briefs in Political Science showcases emerging theory, empirical research, and practical applications in political science, policy studies, political economy, public administration, political philosophy, international relations, and related fields. And Humanitarianism in the Asia Pacific is the 50th book, which I think is a lucky number in the series. And we're about to produce the 55th book for that series. So it's an active series, and we're very thrilled to have this title in that series. Part of what we look at as publishing editors is in what way a book will make a novel contribution, not only to the Springer Nature portfolio, but also to our readership and to the field. And the 3 unique selling points that were put forward in the proposal from the outset made a very clear demarcation of the contribution that this would make. So I would just like to highlight these 3 points. The book covers the emerging powers and regional actors in humanitarian affairs in Asia Pacific. It brings together scholars from across Asia Pacific on the increasingly complex and crucial field of humanitarian affairs in the region. And it challenges, and I thought this 3rd point was particularly important, challenges the dominant narratives of humanitarian action with the real world humanitarian experience in Asia Pacific. And I think that regional collation of contributions is where this book has really been a welcome addition to our list. I'd also just like to share, again, without divulging the identity of the reviewers, and I know they did provide very constructive feedback in the manuscript development on some improvements, but both of them strongly recommended the publication of the book, and I've just took these 2 comments from the reviewer reports about what they had to say about the proposal when it was submitted. The first reviewer said that the discussion on humanitarian reform from regions such as Asia Pacific is crucial, a topic that is important for both humanitarian practitioners and scholars. Again, that was very exciting for me as a publishing editor, that it appeals to both demographics in practice and in the scholarly readership. The regional perspectives on humanitarian reform is the strongest dimension of the book. The second reviewer had to say that the strength of this book is its examination of the role of national governments in shaping humanitarianism in the region, its focus on natural disasters, the presentation of country-specific perspectives and multilateral cooperation, and the up-to-date political science analysis that the book presents. It is relevant to development practitioners, NGO leaders, students in development and international relations and in political science. And then lastly, because I know our time is up, I just want to highlight that I'm looking to give away a free hard copy of the book for a social media post relating to the book in the next month. We're also running a promotion at the moment, and I'm hoping Al and Lina will share the flyer with you, which has that discount coupon on it. So it's 20% off the print and the ebook for the next month. And again, I'd like to give away 1 hard copy to the best social media post in the next month regarding the book. So please share this with your colleagues, students. It's open to everybody beyond the attendees of today's session. And finally, I'd just like to thank everybody, particularly Al and Nina and the support staff at NTU, including the library and the research office, for helping distribute the information about today's event. And a special thanks to Dr. Prasad for the interesting discussion and for highlighting the important work that this book has brought attention to. So thanks very much to everybody. And if there are any questions about the book, you can please drop me an email anytime. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Alex. And yes, we'll grab the flyer from you and then circulate it to the registered participants for them to follow up with hopefully some very engaging social media posts about the book.
Oh, I should add, Al. Yeah, sorry,
yeah,
the hashtag
sure.
there. I skipped through the hashtag quite quickly. It's Humanitarianism APAC 21 and Springer Social Science. So please include those two hashtags in your posts. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Okay, so thanks to Alex, thanks to the contributors and the panelists, so the contributors in the audience who I mentioned before, as well as to the 4 panelists today, and to Lina, the co-editor with me for this book. I'm happy to say that it is available online, as Alex just mentioned, and available in hard copies. So please do go ahead and buy it. So with that, I would like to bring this webinar to a close, and we'll be in touch with the discount flyer in the next few days. So thank you all once again